Chapter 4. Object Symbols of the Self, the Old Testament Prophet as Foreshadow. In the beginning the Word was, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There appeared a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness to the light, so that through him everyone might believe. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. John chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. The epigraph above adds further weight to the culminating point of chapter 3, which introduced John the Baptist as a primary example of the foreshadow archetype. As we have seen, the foreshadow represents the theoretical ideal of what the shadow can be, a dark and wild messenger from the collective unconscious who, rather than nipping at the heels of the immature ego, is instead sent ahead to prepare the way for an era-defining embodiment of the self. In place of the more traditional nativity narratives in Matthew and Luke, the Gospel of John begins with this symbolic nativity. The Word became flesh is a clear image of the birth or earthly manifestation of the archetype of the self. But from the Christian perspective, it is also important to note that if, quote, in the beginning the Word was, end quote, then for all of time leading up to Christ's birth, the archetype of the self was not flesh, i.e., not manifest in human form. With this in mind, we must to some degree broaden and de-literalize our new formed understanding of the foreshadow archetype before we can continue further. Remaining within the biblical paradigm, chapter 4 therefore analyzes a series of Old Testament figures whose respective roles as foreshadow pave the way not for a human embodiment of the self, as John does for Jesus, but rather for an object symbol of the self. These foreshadow figures, Moses, Samson, Samuel, and Elijah, naturally emerge from the liminal boundaries between distinct phases in Israel's long mytho-religious history in order to prepare the people for the next evolution of their God image, their next symbol of the self. In previous chapters, the term symbol of the self has at times been used to describe human figures like the Buddha or Jesus of Nazareth, a practice established by Jung himself when he titled one of his studies, Christ, a Symbol of the Self. But this is one of the great powers of the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Archetypal essence can manifest in seemingly any form, ranging from human vessels to symbolic language, or even, as this chapter will demonstrate, in inanimate objects. And in fact, we have already seen this protean or mercurial quality of the archetypes in action. Chapter 3 brought in a 2nd century CE pseudo-Clementine thinker who greatly impressed Jung with his psychological understanding of biblical pairs. But notably, this ancient thinker does not limit his study only to human pairs. Quote, and in the same way from Noah 2 symbols of the Spirit, the unclean and the clean, were sent out, the black raven and after it the white dove. End quote. As with his treatment of the supposedly godless shadow brother Esau, it is as though the larger tradition needed to create folk narratives to cast this messenger raven not merely as unclean, but as a sort of evil trickster figure. Quote, when he desired to dispatch the raven, the bird said, the Lord thy master hates me, and thou dost hate me too. Thy master hates me, for he bade thee take 7 pairs of the clean animals into the ark, but 2 pairs of the unclean animals to which I belong. Thou hatest me, for thou dost not choose as a messenger a bird of one of the kinds of which there are 7 pairs in the ark, but thou sendest me, and of my kind there is but 1 pair. Suppose now I should perish by reason of heat or cold, would not the world be poor by a whole species of animal? This quick-talking style is common to the cunning and even heroic trickster figures of many cultures. But within the biblical paradigm, it is surely meant to associate the raven with a more sinister trickster, the fork-tongued serpent of Genesis, and thereby to Satan himself. Must this messenger raven raven be evil in order for its brother, the white dove, to be good? Must Esau be godless to explain God's covenant with Jacob? Again, there seems to be evidence of an all too common egocentric bias that elevates ego consciousness at the expense of the collective unconscious and its messenger, the shadow. The symbolic association between the archetype of the self and the white dove was already shown at the central moment of Christ's baptism, as John the Baptist lowers Jesus into the Jordan. The heavens open up, and the Holy Spirit descends like a dove toward him. But the chapters ahead will demonstrate that the raven, with its dark feathers, its role as a messenger, its mythic gift of foresight, and its usual dwelling place in the forests, is likewise associated with the foreshadow archetype. For the present, what is most important to note is that the foreshadow will not always pave the way for a human embodiment of the self. Just as the raven is sent out before the potently symbolic white dove, the foreshadow's mission may be to usher in a supreme symbol, to establish the Ark of the Covenant, to serve as the keeper of the crown, and to anoint the first king, or even to prepare the people for the destructive end of an era which is surely nigh. Symbol and sign. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats, and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is a shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. Though they are often considered to be synonyms in colloquial usage, the words symbol and sign have distinct definitions in Jung's psychology. Edinger clearly differentiates the two terms in a chapter of Ego and Archetype titled Searching for Meaning. Quote, a sign is a token of meaning that stands for a known entity. By this definition, language is a system of signs, not symbols. A symbol, on the other hand, is an image or representation which points to something essentially unknown, a mystery. A sign communicates abstract, objective meaning, whereas a symbol conveys living, subjective meaning. A symbol has a subjective dynamism, which exerts a powerful attraction and fascination on the individual. It is a living, organic entity which acts as a releaser and transformer of psychic energy. End quote. In this sense, a stop sign would be, as the name clearly indicates, an example of a Jungian sign. The bright red color, the bold capital letters, and of course the meaning of the single word at its center are meant to convey no more and no less than the simple message, stop. But though the meaning of a sign is objective and known, it is not necessarily simple. In the field of mathematics, for instance, we use what Jung would call signs to stand for numerical values which are categorized as complex, irrational, or even imaginary. The number I is an example from this third group, defined as the square root of a -1. But because the square root of -1 is purely theoretical, a sign is used to represent this imaginary number that is nonetheless objective and knowable. In the most literal sense, the Christian cross is therefore also a sign. The shape is directly and objectively a representation of the cross upon which Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. But the deeper meaning of the cross is subjective, undefinable, and mysterious, making it a great example of a Jungian symbol. For some, the cross is a reminder of a theological belief that is central to many branches of Christianity, that Christ died for the sins of mankind. For others, the cross is a symbolic of the tension of all pairs of opposites, the horizontal line separating heaven and earth, the vertical line dividing right and left, good from evil, and there at the intersection is the God-man, both dying and rising all at once. For still others, like Campbell, the symbol of the cross is more mysterious yet. Quote, loss, death, birth, loss, death, and so on. By contemplating the cross, you are contemplating a symbol of the mystery of life. Edinger nicely sums up the distinction between the Jungian sign and the Jungian symbol, saying that, quote, a sign is dead, but a symbol is alive. But if symbols are truly alive, we must assume that they can also die. What does it look like when symbols die? T.S. Eliot's enduring poem, The Wasteland, seemed to both usher in and embody the modern era that began to take shape in the aftermath of the First World War. As his central metaphor, Eliot compares the global disillusionment and existential crisis that accompanied the carnage of war to the unredeemed wasteland of Arthurian legend, a mythic setting that will be explored more closely in association with the foreshadow figure Merlin in the next chapter. For Eliot, the wasteland is an image of what happens when the symbol system that used to grant life meaning, including Christian symbols, are reduced to a, quote, heap of broken images, end quote. With this in mind, perhaps it is not merely that, quote, a sign is dead and the symbol is alive, end quote, but more often that a sign is a dead symbol and a symbol a living sign. And this contention seems to hold true with our previous example of the Christian cross. The practice of crucifixion existed long before the martyrdom of Jesus Christ. As such, we must assume that the cross also existed at that time as a direct objective sign. But the potency of Christ as an embodiment of the self seems to have imbued the sign of the cross with deep, mysterious, and symbolic meaning. The cross itself became a potent symbol of the self. Now, in Eliot's modern wasteland, as we hear the proverbial death rattle of once powerful symbol systems, the cross is in mortal danger of becoming once again a mere sign. Sic transit gloria mundi. As we grasp for meaning while our symbols erode before us, Eliot's fear in a handful of dust, daily life in the wasteland continues. Quote, the result is a pervasive feeling of meaninglessness and alienation from life. Whether or not a new collective religious symbol will emerge remains to be seen. The picture painted here is certainly bleak, and yet, at its heart, the metaphor of the wasteland is in fact one of undying potential. However long the drought, however dire the captivity of the people, the wasteland can always be redeemed. The Grail Knight can ask the question. The Ark of the Covenant can return to Israel. The prophets of Baal can be rejected for Yahweh. Maintaining the symbolic vitality of a culture, it seems, is a cyclical, ongoing process. Like the annual inundation of the Nile, symbols of the self must periodically be renewed. But occasionally, the mutual bond between a people and their God image becomes alienated beyond repair. It is at these times that a new symbol of the self must manifest, often heralded by the sudden emergence of a foreshadow figure. The biblical prophet as foreshadow. From the very moment that Moses first attempts to reacquaint the Israelites with their ancestral deity, the relationship between Yahweh and his people appears to be strained and inconsistent. In The Sacred and the Profane, Eliade addresses how almost comically incorrigible the children of Israel are. Each time that the ancient Hebrews experience a period of peace and prosperity, they abandon Yahweh for the Baals and the Ashtoreths and their neighbors. Only historical catastrophes force them to return to Yahweh. End quote. Despite the extraordinary miracles that they witness, sometimes on a daily basis, the Israelites consistently forget their God the moment they are left to their own devices, as if suffering from collective amnesia. It is important to note that for the Israelites, Yahweh is not an image or symbol of the self, but rather what Jungians would call the self per se, the eternal source within the collective unconscious from which symbols of the self draw essence. In fact, Yahweh is largely defined by his strict laws against the use of idols, images, or symbols in the act of worship. Quote, "You shall not make for yourselves a sculptured image or any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them." Ironically, on a psychological level, it may be this iconoclastic, anti-image rhetoric at the core of Judaism which makes the Israelites so forgetful of their God. Where other cultures could make visual representations of their gods as a reminder of devotion when faith is low, the children of Israel must simply attempt to keep the faith until that faith is rekindled by means of awesome miracles or awful punishments. Nowhere are the shortcomings of this religious model more apparent than in the incident of the golden calf. At the very time that Moses is receiving the Ten Commandments, which will be Israel's organizing principle for hundreds of years to come, the people become impatient and forgetful. Quote, "Come, make us a god who shall go before us. For that man Moses who brought us from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him." Though the scene certainly reflects poorly on the short-sightedness of the Israelites, psychologically it is also an indictment of a deity whose strict aniconism actually stifles his own symbolic potency and arguably creates an unsustainable relationship with his people moving forward. In God, a biography, Jack Miles takes up the unconventional task of analyzing the God of the Old Testament, not as an object of theological belief, nor as a historical figure, but as the main character of a great literary work, with all of the personality and all of the flaws typical of a developing protagonist. Quote, "God is no saint, strange to say. There is much to object to in him, and many attempts have been made to improve him." End quote. It is in this sense that I speak of Yahweh's supposed errors, and Miles would likely agree that God's expectations for devotion from a people who are neither allowed to see him nor form representations in his place are largely unrealistic. But Miles' contention that God can err has deeper and far more radical implications. God can see the errors of his ways, God can grow, God can change his mind. Most notably, Yahweh shows elasticity and open-mindedness in his repeated attempts to find a God image or a symbol of the self that his people can connect with. The long mytho-religious history of Israel can be divided into fairly distinct phases based off of the people's relationship with Yahweh. In the time of the patriarchs, no earthly manifestation of the self exists at all. But in the era of the judges, society is ideologically organized around a highly potent object symbol of the self. The Ten Commandments are carved into two stone tablets and placed in the Ark of the Covenant at the very heart of Israel, thus forming the center of a mandala from which the 12 tribes symbolically radiate. Eventually, the people lose faith in the authority of the judges and in the power of the ark and demand a king so that they can be, quote, "like all other nations." End quote. The throne of the ego replaces the ark of the self as the center of Israel's mandala. Despite the best efforts of the prophets to keep the kingdom on track, the sanctity of the crown eventually deteriorates. The mandala loses its symbolic center, and Israel is therefore destined for its coming destruction. For all the talk of Yahweh's rigidity, quote, "I, the Lord, do not change, end quote, he proves remarkably open to compromise. Despite clear concerns about the corruptibility of manifest symbols of any sort, the God of the Old Testament allows first for the ark, and eventually for a king, an earthly representation of the divine. In Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tale, von Franz argues that Yahweh is right to be concerned. Quote, "It seems an archetypal law of general validity that every symbolism which has taken shape and form in collective human consciousness wears out after a certain time and resists renewal owing to a certain inertia of consciousness." In a big picture sense, Israel's relationship with its God is in perpetual decline. With each paradigmatic shift, the symbolic manifestation of the self is further disconnected from its source and disempowered. But this decline is not linear, it's spiral. And at each nadir, a foreshadow, Moses, Samson, Samuel, Elijah, is called to usher in the next symbol of the self, to begin a new era in Israel's history. Whether he be called judge, priest, or indeed prophet, the foreshadow nevertheless serves a prophetic role. To this end, where previous chapters emphasized the shadow qualities within the foreshadow, we will now shift our focus to explore the archetype's gifts of foresight and its unique role as forerunner to the new dispensation. Moses, foreshadow of the ark. His kindred and all of Israel knew that the child was destined for great things, for he was barely 4 months old when he began to prophesy, saying, quote, "In the days to come I shall receive the Torah from the flaming torch." Louis Ginsberg, Legends of the Bible, 292. As we will see in other foreshadow figures, Moses' sudden rise to prominence occurs during a significant period of transition for Israel. The covenant of Abraham, which skipped over Ishmael to Isaac and again over Esau to Jacob, is then disseminated to all 12 of Jacob's sons. After being rescued from the famine by their brother Joseph, Jacob's sons settle in Egypt, their descendants thereafter known as the children of Israel. But as their numbers swell over the next 2 centuries in Egypt, so too does their plight. What was once a voluntary settlement in a prime location slowly becomes servitude and even enslavement when, quote, "a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph." What is arguably even more significant than Israel's loss of its place of privilege, however, is the loss of its God image. Without a physical representation of their covenant with Yahweh, without a symbol of the self, the children of Israel forget the God of the patriarchs to such a degree that they do not even recognize his name when Moses returns from the wasteland with news from the burning bush. The circumstances of Moses' unlikely conception and birth are similar to that of John the Baptist in a few notable ways. First, Amram and Jochebed, Moses' parents, are both nearing 130 years old when they conceive. Unlike John's mother, Jochebed is never specifically said to be barren. Still, the advanced age of the couple is another reminder that the foreshadow archetype is, quote, "born in spite of time and nature." End quote. Additionally, the fathers of both figures are Levite priests. And yet Moses, like John, will reject the traditional role of the priest, instead choosing the wilderness itself as his de facto temple. A far more peculiar similarity between the two can be found only in non-canonical folk narratives. According to legend, Moses was, quote, "not yet a day old when he began to walk and speak with his parents, and as though he were an adult, he refused to drink milk from his mother's breast." He also prophesied at this young age, not of his own future greatness, but of the symbol of the self which he will bring to his people. Quote, "In the days to come I shall receive the Torah from the flaming torch." Nearly identical accounts of John the Baptist's ultra-precocious first days, as well as those of Merlin, Hahnemann, and other examples of the foreshadow, will be examined in future chapters. The depth psychological implications of this puzzling motif may be to emphasize the urgency of the foreshadow's archetypal role in preparing the world for the self. Again, it is in reference to this sense of urgency that Bulgakov claims, quote, Elizabeth gave birth not merely to an infant who later became the forerunner, she gave birth precisely to the forerunner who had to begin his mission in his infancy. End quote. But in a more subtle way, it may be that the shadow's consistent association with hair is part of the same motif. Abel, Ishmael, and especially Esau are all born red and hairy, indications that they are fully formed from the collective unconscious in diametric opposition to the ego hero, who must grow and develop in accordance with time. But there are also significant differences between John the Baptist and Moses. Quasi-foreshadow figures like Moses, who prepare the people for an object symbol rather than for a personified symbol of the self, seem to take on some of the archetypal qualities of the absent ego hero. Without a personified counterpart to Moses, it is as though the narrative projects certain hero qualities and motifs onto him, the only point of view character. Case in point, Moses' birth has much in common with the traditional hero cycle. Like Jesus, Zeus, and Oedipus, Moses must be protected from the actions of the tyrannical father, king, or god. Like Perseus, Horus, and Sargon of Akkad, Moses is cast into the water and later drawn out. Additionally, Moses' actions and his very personality demonstrate a level of egoism that is not usual to the foreshadow archetype, most especially in his fervent and repeated refusal of his call to adventure, and in his sorrowful pleas to be allowed to enter the promised land. As we saw in chapter 3, John the Baptist is largely defined by his humble devotion to Jesus. He is entirely egoless because Jesus is his ego. He is selfless because Jesus is his self. But again, Moses has no ego counterpart to humble himself to. In this regard, the dual axes model of individuation developed in chapter 3 is more difficult to apply to a single figure like Moses than it was to a clear-cut ego-shadow pair like Jesus and John the Baptist. The model is, however, still applicable on a psychological level if we instead imagine both axes, the ego-self axis and the shadow-foreshadow axis, progressing, quote, within one breast. An internal ego-shadow struggle is, after all, the psychological reality with which each of us must daily contend. Moses' particular role as both ego and shadow also helps to explain his paradoxical destiny as the Hebrew prince of Egypt. The massacre of the innocence motif, which is common to the hero archetype, is here reversed. Instead of a royal prince being raised in secret as a nobody, Moses is a poor Hebrew child who is raised as a prince by the Pharaoh's own daughter. Many years later, Moses emerges from his sheltered existence within the palace, and his two worlds collide when he witnesses an Egyptian taskmaster whipping a Hebrew slave. At this crossroads, Moses is forced to choose between two destinies: the path of ego consciousness as the heir apparent to the throne of Egypt, or the shadow path as Yahweh's intercessor for the Israelites. The moment that he defends the Hebrew slave, he flees into the wilderness, and his role as the foreshadow begins. And it is interesting to note that how this moment, aptly described by Edinger, sets in motion a chain of events that inexorably leads to the beginning of Moses' mission. Quote, the encounter generally occurs in the wilderness or in a fugitive state, i.e. alienation. Moses was a fugitive from the law, pasturing his father-in-law's sheep in the wilderness when Yahweh spoke to him from the burning bush and gave him his life assignment. End quote. Moses can only receive his mission as foreshadow once his personal circumstances align with the symbol set of the archetype. Said another way, the royal palace of Egypt is simply not conducive to the foreshadow. But away from a society surrounded by sheep in the wilderness, the wasteland of the collective unconscious, Moses finally looks the part. Time and time again, the familiar long flowing beard, the dark robe of the shepherd's staff, not to mention the hairy sheep themselves, are directly associated with the shadow, and more specifically with the foreshadow archetype. But as was seen with Esau, Ishmael, Steppenwolf, Mephistopheles, and other shadow figures discussed in previous chapters, Moses is not simply surrounded by hairy animals, he is symbolically synonymous with them. In Ginsberg's folktale version of the story, Pharaoh's sudden fear of the Israelites begins with a prophetic dream. Quote, he beheld an old man before him with a balance in his hand, and he saw him taking all the elders, nobles, and great men of Egypt, tying them together, and laying them in one scale of the balance, while he put a tender kid into the other. The kid bore down the pan in which it lay until it hung lower than the other with the bound Egyptians. End quote. Though the dream itself does not explicitly connect the young goat with Moses, Pharaoh's magical dream interpreters do. In that version, when all of the male Hebrew children are killed, it is not simply as a means of population control, but is specifically to prevent the prophesied birth of Moses, the tender kid from Pharaoh's dreams. Another non-canonical connection between Moses and the goat can be seen in a peculiar iconographic tradition in which Moses is depicted with horns. Linguistic historians have long since explained this phenomenon away as a simple translation error. As Moses descends Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments in his hands, his face-to-face interaction with the self leaves his head horned with light. But just because we can trace a visual detail to its presumptive origin does not necessarily mean that it is therefore invalid. Indeed, I contend that though the horns of Moses likely did originate from this overly literal translation of the text, its survival and incorporation into Moses's larger mythos indicates that the association is deeply resonant with the figure's true archetypal core. The most famous example of this phenomenon is undoubtedly Michelangelo's so-called Horned Moses, currently held in the San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome. This statue offers a particularly valuable opportunity for reflection in this depth psychological study because Freud himself wrote a detailed essay about its iconography. Quote, the Moses of Michelangelo is presented as seated. His body faces forward. His head, with its mighty beard, looks to the left. His right foot rests on the ground, and his left leg is raised so that only the toes touch the ground. His right arm links to the tables of the law with a portion of his beard. On the surface, it does not appear that Freud's analysis deals much with the horns themselves. His goal is to gain a deeper understanding of why Michelangelo chose to depict this particular moment in time and thereby offer a compelling interpretation for the sculpture's true meaning. But what is more relevant to the study at hand is the great emotional effect that the sculpture had on Freud himself, which he describes saying, quote, no piece of statuary has ever made a stronger impression on me than this, end quote. Written in 1914, just 2 years after his break from Jung, Freud speaks directly about the very attitude which so often enraged Jung. Quote, some rationalistic or perhaps an analytical turn of mind in me rebels against being moved by a thing without knowing why I am thus affected and what it is that affects me. To be sure, we are no more equipped to answer this riddle than Freud was himself. Still, there is one conclusion which I feel we can safely make. For a work of art to endure, for it to grip the imaginations of extraordinary minds such as Freud's for over 500 years, it must be that Michelangelo's horned Moses is archetypally true. The dark and otherworldly stare, the cascading beard, and indeed the animalistic horns are together a faithful and potent manifestation of an archetypal essence which urgently wants to be brought into consciousness. One final association between Moses and a hairy animal has already been discussed in this chapter, the incident of the golden calf. Quote, "Come, make us a God who shall go before us, for that man Moses, who brought us from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him." End quote. When thoroughly inspected, the logic of this statement proves rather paradoxical. When their leader disappears, one might expect the children of Israel to choose another leader, not another God. In addition to illustrating the extraordinary forgetfulness of the Israelites, this scene therefore also draws a direct equivalency between Moses and the golden calf itself. Moses, whose coming was foreseen in Pharaoh's dream in the guise of a goat, and whose terrible countenance is horned with light, is replaced in the minds of his people by a golden statue of a calf. Enraged by their blasphemy, Moses smashes the 2 stone tablets of the law, melts the golden calf, and forces the Israelites to drink its ashes mixed with water as punishment for succumbing to idolatry so quickly in his absence. Eventually, the children of Israel repent of their sins, and Moses is allowed by Yahweh to carve, quote, 2 stone tables like the first, end quote. For miles, this is a monumental occasion when the Israelites are first allowed to have a physical representation of their God, a symbol of the self. Quote, Moses takes the tablets of the law, called in the text simply the covenant, puts them in their cabinet, the ark, and places the cover or mercy seat atop the ark inside of the tabernacle. The Lord has forbidden the Israelites to make an image of him, but they are permitted to make a throne for him and adorn it with the winged creatures or cherubim, understood to attend him in heaven. End quote. Though he does not yet know it himself, Moses' earthly mission as foreshadow is already coming to a close. In Egypt, the Israelites were an unorganized mob with no leader, no true home, and no memory of their shared history and ancestral deity. But in his role as foreshadow, Moses led them to Mount Sinai to retrieve an organizing principle, an ideological center for their society. Symbolically, if not geographically, the 12 tribes of Israel therefore radiate like a mandala around a cohesive center. The 10 Commandments on the tablets of stone are safely locked away in the Ark of the Covenant, hidden to all but Moses himself within the Holy of Holies, and protected at all times by the Levite priests within the tabernacle. At the end of the book of Exodus, Israel's societal mandala is somewhat stable, but it is not permanent. Indeed, the whole concept of the tabernacle was to create a traveling home for Yahweh's Shekinah, or divine presence. But it is always assumed to be a short-term solution until the Lord's temple can be built within the Promised Land. The journey to this Promised Land is, of course, extended by 40 years of aimless wandering when the Israelites repeatedly fail to uphold their side of the covenant. Through it all, Moses remains the unquestioned leader, his life extended to 120 years in recognition for his faithful service. One of the more perplexing and seemingly unfair moments in the Old Testament narrative comes at this point, when despite his service, Yahweh does not allow Moses to enter the promised land. Quote, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will assign it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you shall not cross there." If we take Yahweh at his word, this harsh punishment was levied a year prior when Moses took credit for God's miracle, saying, quote, "Listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock?" As we have already argued, the absence of an ego counterpart to Moses within the narrative results in his taking on certain qualities and motifs that are more typical of the hero archetype. It only makes sense, therefore, that Moses' Achilles' heel is an attitude of egoism which is unbefitting of the foreshadow. Notice that Moses is not only being punished for his ego, but also by means of it. Said another way, exclusion from the promised land would not be an effective punishment in the first place, if not for Moses' sense of ego, for this final state of exile is in fact quite natural to the foreshadow. John the Baptist knows that he must die before Jesus' ascension. Quote, "He must become greater and I less." End quote. Samuel is miraculously aged so that he can die without witnessing David anointed as king in Saul's place. Merlin says, "I shall see no grail, nor would I have it otherwise," before willingly entering his crystal prison. The foreshadow's fate is therefore a punishment only from the perspective of the ego. On a hill overlooking the promised land, Moses is taken up to his God with an air of mystery. No one knows his burial place to this day, which is usual to the foreshadow archetype. As will be demonstrated with the other foreshadow figures, the mystery of this wilderness resting place adds an important sense of ambiguity to the archetype, which can never truly die. In the desert, God's wonders would appear, though it would be at the same time the grave of the human herd to be entrusted to him in the future, and also his own last resting place. He had a presentiment at the very beginning of his career that the desert would be the scene of his activity, which would not only come true in the present order of things, but also will be true in the latter days, when he will appear in the desert again and lead into the promised land the generation arisen from their graves that he brought forth from Egyptian bondage. With the death of Moses, the leader's mantle is passed on to Joshua. This is one final reminder that the foreshadow is not a person or a role, but a living archetype. Moses was neither a charismatic nor particularly likable man. The great miracles he performed were never his own, but a power working through him. Of these many miracles, there is none more synonymous with the name of Moses than the iconic parting of the Red Sea. And yet, immediately after the death of Moses, Joshua shows that he too can be a conduit for the powers of the self. Quote, "Now select 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 man from each tribe. When the feet of the priests bear the ark of the Lord, the sovereign of all the earth, come to rest in the waters of the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan, the waters coming from upstream will be cut off and will stand in a single heap." Israel's new symbol of the self, the Ark of the Covenant, makes its way into the promised land, and the era of Judges begins. Samson, the final judge. "You are going to conceive and bear a son. Let no razor touch his head, for the boy is to be a Nazarite to God from the womb on. He shall be the first to deliver Israel from the Philistines." Judges chapter 13, verse 5. The Old Testament judge is a far more nebulous role than it is often presumed to be. For one, the term is not even used as a noun, but rather as a verb, i.e., Samson judged Israel in the days of the Philistines for 20 years. As such, There is no conclusive list of which biblical leaders count as judges and which do not. But for the purposes of this dissertation, the era of Judges is meant to describe the time period after the establishment of a unified culture under Moses, but before the anointing of the first king of Israel. Just as Moses served a mixed role as an ego shadow figure, the judges of Israel were forced to take on the responsibilities of both a political and a spiritual leader. Later on, when he finally allows Israel to become a monarchy, Yahweh establishes the role of prophet as a sort of counterbalance to the unavoidable flaws of a mortal king. But leading Israel in the first years, just before the beginning of this kingdom, Samson must hold the mantle of a de facto prophet king. As such, he, even more perhaps than Moses, takes on traits of both the ego hero and the shadow. Like John the Baptist, Moses, and the many foreshadow figures which will be explored in future chapters, Samson's conception is miraculously announced to an unlikely couple. Quote, "You are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Now be careful not to drink wine or other intoxicant, or to eat anything unclean, for you are going to conceive and bear a son. Let no razor touch his head, for the boy is to be a Nazarite to God from the womb on. He shall be the first to deliver Israel from the Philistines." Samson's upbringing as a Nazarite labels him as a foreshadow figure in two important ways. Firstly, as we have already seen, there is no symbol which so directly indicates a connection to the unconscious shadow world as wild, uncivilized hair. Archetypally, we must imagine that Samson is, like Esau, some versions of Merlin, and of course the monkey god Hanuman, born covered in thick hair. This prenatal hair represents the foreshadow's direct connection to the womb of the collective unconscious, which grows uninterrupted so long as, quote, no, end quote. To some degree, the Nazarite's prohibitions against impure food and intoxicating drink represent the very same thing. Where other children are socialized in the ways of human consciousness, the Nazarite must remain forever a virgin to the trappings of the civilized world. But it is important to remember that what sets the foreshadow apart from more traditional shadow figures is his egoless devotion to his mission. Samson does not avoid complex food and alcohol to stay fit, nor does he grow his hair out for stylistic reasons, but rather because he was given by his mother as a Nazarite to God. Like a sacrificial lamb, the foreshadow is willingly left at the altar of the self as a gift from the collective unconscious. As he grows, Samson begins to display qualities of a more fantastic and mythological nature than those seen in previous examples of the foreshadow. His devotion as a Nazarite gives him the power to perform superhuman feats of strength. In his dissertation, The Heroic Shadow, Development of the Ego Shadow Complex, Richard Caro argues that Samson's physical strength is symbolic of an inner strength, the strength, quote, of an integrated shadow, end quote. Caro also notes the strong resemblance between the biblical Samson and the Greek demigod Heracles. Both figures are born under miraculous circumstances. Both possess superhuman strengths as well as superhuman tempers. In their various travels, both are set upon by a great lion, and both kill it with their bare hands. To many, Heracles or Hercules is the epitome of the archetypal hero of ego consciousness, but Caro disagrees, calling him instead a shadow hero. As evidence for this claim, Caro notes that after defeating the Nemean lion, he therefore wears its magical hide. Quote, "Thus Heracles kills the beast within himself and becomes it." End quote. Though Caro's dissertation only deals briefly with the figure of Samson, textual evidence suggests that he too is an integrated shadow hero. To the great displeasure of his parents, and despite presumably having his choice of any of the Israelitish women, Samson chooses his bride from among the Philistines, his mortal enemies. It is on his way to obtain the Philistine bride that Samson is attacked by a full-grown lion. With divine strength, he tears the lion apart and leaves its carcass on the side of the road. Heading along the same way a year later for his own wedding, Samson sees that a hive of bees has formed inside of the lion's skeleton. So, instead of wearing the lion's hide as Heracles does, Samson integrates the shadow by scooping the sweet honey out of the beast and eating it as he walks along. At the same time, he comes up with a riddle which wonderfully sums up the great potential hidden within the shadow, what we have called the foreshadow archetype. Quote, out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. Instead of fleeing from the shadow, Samson literally embraces it by marrying his mortal enemy. Instead of burying the shadow, Samson finds the sweet gifts which are hidden within its hairy exterior and is fed by it. If the feats of Samson seen within the Bible are fantastic, those found in non-canonical sources are far more so. The first evidence of Samson's gigantic strength he gave when he uprooted two great mountains and rubbed them against each other. Such feats he was able to perform as often as the Spirit of God was poured out over him. Whenever this happened, it was indicated by his hair. It began to move and emit a bell-like sound, which could be heard far off. Besides, while the Spirit rested upon him, he was able with one stride to cover a distance equal to that between Zorah and Eshtaol. Grandiose and fantastical feats of this sort are at first difficult to square away with the more grounded image of the foreshadow seen in the personage of John the Baptist, but I contend that they are simply mythological expressions of very real qualities within the foreshadow archetype. Indeed, there is a prophecy of the Baptist's mission that he will, quote, move mountains and hills, end quote, to make a highway in the wilderness for the Lord. This prophecy is, of course, taken as a metaphor for the forerunner's inner power. But Samson's ability to uproot great mountains must be seen as a more literal image of this same power. An obscure connection like this, miraculously moving mountains, might be taken as mere coincidental if it did not also appear in the narratives of other examples of the foreshadow. In his efforts to unite England before the arrival of Arthur, Merlin is credited with the formation of Stonehenge, when he lifts and transports, quote, the great stones from Ireland by magic, and they still stand in the burial ground at Salisbury. When Lakshmana is injured in battle, the Hindu monkey god Hanuman is set to fetch a healing herb, but he is unsure which plant he needs, quote, prompting him to lift the entire mountain, end quote. Because of his unsevered connection to the collective unconscious, the foreshadow can be a conduit for archetypal powers capable of accomplishing superhuman feats in service to the self. What symbol of the self does Samson foreshadow? What new dispensation does he herald? Before his miraculous conception, the angel of the Lord states clearly that his mission is, quote, to deliver Israel from the Philistines. But this is certainly not a clear-cut symbol of the self. To understand Samson's true role, we must remember that the foreshadow's emergence signals not only the beginning of an age, but also the end of one. Just as John, quote, bridges together the Old Testament and the New Testament as, quote, living boundary marker for the new dispensation, so too does Samson act as a symbolic bookend for the era of the Judges and, more importantly, the era of the Ark of the Covenant. It is as though, before reluctantly agreeing to give Israel a king so that they may, quote, be like all the other nations, end quote, Yahweh sends Samson to them, a charismatic, larger-than-life judge who colorfully demonstrates the power of the ark by delivering Israel from her mortal enemy as no other leader could. Samson's life and his death are devoted to this mission. Integrating the shadow does not often come without a cost, and so Delilah, his Philistine bride, becomes his downfall. As the famous story goes, Delilah uses Samson's love against him and manipulates him into telling her the secret of his superhuman strength. The Philistines cut his 7 long locks of hair, thereby also severing him from the collective unconscious, the source of his shadow energy. Once captured, Samson is blinded and forced to dance in front of a large crowd for their entertainment. When his hands find their way to the 2 great pillars to which he is chained, he prays for his strength to return. His hair, perhaps magically, begins to grow back, and Samson topples the temple down around him, so that, quote, those who were slain by him as he died outnumbered those who had been slain by him when he lived. And the foreshadow's mission extends beyond the grave. Quote, even after his death, Samson was a shield unto the Israelites. Fear of him had so cowed the Philistines that for 20 years they did not dare attack the Israelites. Samson is Yahweh's last attempt to sway his people from their desire for a king. But in the years of relative peace after Samson's death, the notoriously great forgetful children of Israel finally convince Yahweh that the Ark of the Covenant has lost its potency as a symbol of the self, remembering again von Franz's warning that every symbol eventually, quote, wears out after a certain time and resists renewal. It is no coincidence that after nearly 400 years, the Battle of Shiloh marks the first time that the Israelites lose the Ark of the Covenant. After only 7 months, the Ark's latent power as a symbol of the self wreaks so much havoc that the Philistines hurriedly send it back to the Israelites along with gifts to pacify their God. Still, the Ark of the Covenant never again serves as the organizing principle and axis mundi for Israel. Samuel, foreshadow of the kingdom. Quote, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as he pleased. End quote. Judges chapter 21, verse 25. After the death of Samson, the epigraph above is repeated with enough consistency so as to become a sort of motto for the book of Judges. Many would argue against my calling Samson the, quote, last judge of Israel, instead offering Eli or even Samuel this designation. But in addition to the fact that Samson is the final judge from the book of Judges itself, it is also important to note that Eli was the high priest in the temple and was therefore unable to hold the dual position of prophet and leader that we have associated with the role of judge. Samuel, on the other hand, becomes the first clear example of a prophet of Israel, a counterbalancing role which presupposes an anointed king of Israel. We have seen that examples of the foreshadow often suddenly emerge from the wilderness, and here we have meant a literal wilderness, the desert, the forest, the wasteland. But the archetype as often appears from within a symbolic wasteland, from Eliot's wasteland, when the symbol system of the past have broken down and society is in dire need of inspiration. This is the world into which Samuel is born. Quote, in those days the word of the Lord was rare, prophecy was not widespread. End quote. The now familiar origin story of the foreshadow begins with Hannah, a devout yet barren woman. While on her annual pilgrimage to the temple in the city of Shiloh, Hannah desperately prays for the Lord to grant her a child and even promises to raise him, like Samson, as a Nazarite. Quote, "If you will grant your maidservant a male child, I will dedicate him to the Lord for all of the days of his life, and no razor shall ever touch his head." Interestingly, the high priest Eli mistakes Hannah's heartfelt devotion for drunkenness and reprimands her. Narratively, this moment allows Hannah to defend her sobriety. Quote, "I have drunk no wine or other strong drink," thereby demonstrating that the parental side of the Nazirite vow has been upheld. But additionally, the scene allows Eli to take on the symbolic role as an angel of the Lord prophesying the birth of Samuel. Like Moses, Samuel is born prematurely, perhaps signaling the almost magical precociousness of the foreshadow archetype. As soon as Hannah is able, she fulfills her promise and returns to Shiloh to give young Samuel to the temple for a life in service to the Lord. Ginsburg tells a folk version of this arrival at the temple when Eli is horrified to find the 2-year-old Samuel directing the temple priests in the ritual of animal sacrifice. In addition to demonstrating Samuel's direct access to spiritual inspiration and gnosis, the tale is one of many which paint Eli as a well-meaning but ultimately ineffectual spiritual leader. Said another way, Eli is the people's elected priest, not Yahweh's chosen prophet. Eli's declining role is also shown in the sacrilegious and immoral acts of his two infamous sons, Hophni and Phinehas, to which Eli fails to put an end. The blatant abuses of their priestly powers are placed in stark contrast to Samuel's righteous actions. When a holy man arrives and prophesies against Eli and his sons, it is also a prophecy about the loss of the ark, and more important still, a prophecy of Samuel's new role as foreshadow to the first kings of Israel. Quote, "This shall be a sign for you, the fate of your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. They shall both die on the same day, and I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will act in accordance with my wishes and my purposes. I will build for him an enduring house, and he shall walk before my anointed evermore." What should we make of this lofty prophecy that Samuel shall walk before Yahweh's anointed evermore? For one, a lowly prophet would surely walk behind the royal retinue or risk the wrath of the king. Additionally, Samuel himself cannot be expected to serve this role evermore, but only until his own death. But more important than either of these is the realization that Israel has never had a king before, and so this is a prophecy not only for Samuel, but also for the beginning of a new societal order. On our depth psychological level, this prophecy perfectly sums up the mission of the foreshadow archetype: to walk before in time and prepare the way for a culture's next symbol of the self. In a span of about 5 years, Israel lost her greatest judge, Samson, her ideological center, the Ark of the Covenant, and the high priest of the temple, and his two priestly sons. As such, a new symbol of the self was more needed than ever before. But in a chapter which purportedly deals with with object rather than personified symbols of the self, where does a king fit in? A king is a personified figure, to be sure, but to what degree can a mortal, flawed king ever live up to Jung's archetype of the self, the, quote, "embodiment of total wholeness and balance, and for all intents and purposes, the God image"? In Shadow and Evil and Fairy Tale, von Franz speaks in depth about this very problem. Quote, "You might say that the king has all the aspects of a symbol of the self, but because he is the life principle and image of God and the center of physical and spiritual organization, and in that way carries the projection of the self, the regulating, dominating center of the aspect of totality. But that is not right, insofar as the archetype of the self is, according to our experience, not so much bound to time as that. Continuing on, von Franz brings up the all too common image of the, quote, dying king, or the sick or old king who has to be deposed, end quote. When the people finally demand a king, Samuel speaks directly to the dichotomy between the ideal king and the real king. Quote, "This will be the practice of the kings who will rule over you. He will take your sons and appoint them as his charioteers and horsemen, and they will serve as outrunners for his chariots. He will appoint them as his chiefs of thousands and of fifties, and they will have to plow his fields, reap his harvests, and make his weapons and equipped for his chariots. He will take your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take a tenth part of your flocks, and you shall become his slaves. The day will come when you cry out because of the king whom you yourselves have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you on that day." The inevitable flaws of an earthly king are simply at odds with the archetype of the self, or even a symbolic manifestation of that archetype. For this reason, we must assume that the deeply significant symbol set which surrounds the king, the royal attire, the ceremonial pomp, and the divine honors afforded, is not in service to the king at all, but to the crown, the throne, and the kingdom that he represents. It is only in the foreshadows of visions of the future that a king can ever hope to carry the archetypal mantle as the self, and it is this future potential which the foreshadow humbly serves. As should be no surprise, the Israelites do not heed the warnings of Yahweh or his prophet Samuel. More than any sincere desire for a renewed connection with their God, the Israelites care about appearance. They want a king so that they might look like, quote, all the other nations, end quote. And so Yahweh gives them King Saul, a man who in every way looks the part of the archetypal king. Saul is an, quote, excellent young man, end quote, who is a head taller than any of the people, and no one among the Israelites is handsomer than he. End quote. The story of Saul's secret anointment by Samuel and his eventual crowning as king has much in common with the legendary rise of King Arthur, a figure who will be discussed in reference to Merlin the magician in chapter 5. In both tales, the foreshadow figure prophetically sees that the supposedly low-born youth will be king and makes secret arrangements for his ascension. One day, Saul loses his father's flock of donkeys. He takes a servant and wanders the countryside, eventually happening upon the man of God, Samuel, at his shrine. Similarly, one day, young King Arthur mischievously outruns his servant guardian while on a ride through the country and happens upon Merlin, disguised as the holy man of a shrine. Each foreshadow figure tells his young prince only as much as is needed to guide him toward his miraculous crowning as king. Arthur, like Saul, is, quote, a young man of 15, tall and strong for his years, end quote, when the mantle of king is suddenly thrust upon him. In his 15th century work, Le Morte d'Arthur, Sir Thomas Malory immortalized the image of the sword in the stone. Quote, "Therein struck a fair sword naked by the point, and there were letters written about the stone, so that said thus, Whoso pulleth out this sword of the stone and anvil is rightwise born King of all England." In most versions, it is Merlin himself who prepares this test, looking years or even paradoxically centuries ahead to this moment when Arthur fulfills the prophecy, his new people bowing in circles around him. Saul's coronation as king is similarly miraculous. In order to make Yahweh's anointed visible to the people, Samuel casts lots in front of all of Israel. The tribe of Benjamin is selected from among the 12 tribes. Of the Benjamites, the Metrite clan is picked. Finally, Saul himself is chosen from the sons of Kish. When they retrieve the tall youth from his hiding place, Israel shouts together, "Long live the king!" What is perhaps more striking than the similarities between Saul and Arthur, or the particular circumstances of their respective origin stories, is the nearly identical role that Samuel and Merlin play. Von Franz addresses this as well, though not in reference to either of these figures. Quote, "The old man who wanders about building up the new king is a more archaic figure of God who has qualities which have been lost in the dominant. It is an incomplete and more archaic figure of God which has the secret power in this fairy tale to protect the hero and slowly build him up to become the new king." Though von Franz's lecture is about a common fairy tale motif, it proves directly applicable to the figures of Samuel and Merlin. This fact is yet another reminder that the foreshadow's role is an archetypal one, which has been enacted with both consistency and variation throughout the world for thousands of years. The particular reason behind King Saul's gradual descent into madness have been debated by biblical scholars throughout the ages. Perhaps Saul was chosen for his kingly appearance and not for his inner qualities. Perhaps being passed over for so seemingly minor an offense enraged him beyond logic. Perhaps Yahweh caused this mental lapse in order to cast his favorite heir, David, in a better light. In any case, Samuel is soon required to secretly anoint the young shepherd boy David as the next king of Israel, for he is not the foreshadow of Saul, but of the kingdom as a whole. Apocryphal tales add the usual mystery to the foreshadows and praying to be allowed to die without seeing Saul's reckoning. Quote, "God determined to let Samuel age suddenly, and when he died at 52, the people were under the impression the days of an old man had come to an end. So long as he lived, Saul was secure." So with Saul we have, as von Franz says, quote, "a king neither good nor bad, but rather on the decline." End quote. For a time, the sanctity of Israel's new symbol of the self is renewed in the personage of King David. And more than any other, this shepherd turned giant killer is able to maintain the archetypal mantle of the self, becoming the paragon of kingly virtue for centuries after his death. But in order for David to maintain his purity as a symbol of the self, the biblical narrative has to work overtime, bleaching out his errors, some of which greatly outweigh those of his often vilified predecessor. David's son, the wise King Solomon, receives a similar treatment, often being seen as the ideal king despite his obvious faults. Quote, "Solomon followed the Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Phoenicians, and Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was displeasing to the Lord and did not remain loyal to the Lord like his father David." End quote. Even in the supposed golden age of Saul, David, and Solomon, Israel's king is far from an ideal symbol of the self. Elijah, foreshadow of the fall. "What sort of man was it," he asked them, "who came toward you and said these things to you?" "A hairy man," they replied, "with a leather belt tied round his waist." "That's Elisha the Tishbite," he said. 2 Kings chapter 1, verses 7 through 8. After the death of King Solomon, the kingdom splits more or less permanently into two. The northern 12 tribes form the kingdom of Israel and begin immediately with an uninterrupted line of bad kings. Despite the fervent warnings of prophets, including Elijah himself, these kings allow or even encourage the worship of foreign idols and gods, thereby bringing on, according to the biblical narrative, the violent doom that overtakes them. This doom takes the form of an Assyrian invasion and captivity beginning in the 8th century BCE. In the south, the decline of the smaller kingdom of Judah is far more gradual. Unlike Israel, Judah's destruction is stalled by the occasional rule of what the tradition calls good kings, who heed the warnings of the prophets and attempt to lead the people back to Yahweh. These penitent phases are able to delay but not avert the fall of Judah altogether. In the 6th century BCE, a century and a half after the fall of the kingdom of Israel, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II conquers Judah, incorporating many of the elite into his growing empire. When viewed symbolically and depth psychologically, it may be that the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were doomed from the very moment of their schism. Yahweh's goal in allowing first for the Ark of the Covenant and eventually for an anointed king was to erect a stable symbol of the self around which Israel could organize its society. But on a deeper level, this is also why the society was organized into 12 tribes, a balanced multiple of 4. In the first place, it is difficult to say whether the psychological phenomenon of the mandala, which Jung saw as effectively synonymous with his archetype of the self, actually causes stability, or is merely an image of stability. But in either case, the degradation of Israel's mandala after the reign of only 3 kings can be seen as an early sign of its inevitable destruction many centuries later. With this in mind, it is possible to argue that all of the so-called doom and gloom prophets to some degree serve the archetypal role of foreshadow of the fall. In Zealot, the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth, Reza Aslan contends that part of why John the Baptist was so shocking to the people of his day was that he seemed to embody this long-lost doom and gloom aesthetic. Quote, John the Baptist came out of the desert like an apparition, a wild man clothed in camel hair, a leather belt tied round his waist, feeding on locusts and wild honey. He traveled the length of the Jordan River through Judea and Perea, in Bethany and Aenon, preached a simple and dire message. The end was near. The kingdom of God is at hand. But in truth, the Baptist is not simply a callback to the Old Testament prophets in general. More specifically, he is seen as a direct echo of Elijah the prophet. As Jesus himself says, quote, for the teaching of all the prophets and of the law continued until the time of John, and if you are ready to accept it, John is himself the Elijah who was destined to come. John's entire aesthetic harkens back to this iconic prophet, who is described as a hairy man with a leather belt tied around his waist. Aslan is right in saying that John, quote, came out of the desert like an apparition. But the Gospels at least give him some semblance of an origin story. This is not the case for Elijah the prophet, who explodes onto the scene without a hint of his personal history or ancestry other than the inscrutable demonym as a Tishbite. Just as Yahweh sent his most fantastical judge, Samson, as one final attempt to bring the people back to their path, he now sends his most fantastical prophet, Elijah, as a final attempt to redeem the fallen kingdom of Israel, which is arguably at its lowest point. The sorry state of the kingdom is embodied in its infamous king Ahab, who, influenced by his foreign queen Jezebel, does, quote, more to vex the Lord, the God of Israel, than all the kings of Israel who preceded him. Elijah's limitless devotion to Yahweh is therefore set in highest possible contrast against the blasphemy of Ahab and Jezebel. Figure description. Figure 9. Author's rendering of Elijah's offering on Mount Carmel as a mandala. The outer circle, 12 stones, 12 buckets of water, and descending fire as a symbol of the self combine to form a clear mandala. As the messenger of the collective unconscious, it should be no surprise that the foreshadow holds sway over nature itself. Quote, as the Lord lives, the God of Israel whom I serve, there will be no dew or rain except at my bidding. End quote. Elijah's punitive drought lasts for over 3 years before he calls King Ahab and the people of Israel to Mount Carmel for a final showdown between Yahweh and the foreign deities of the day. Quote, how long will you keep hopping between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, and if Baal, follow him. In this contest at Mount Carmel, Elijah arranges to have two unlit animal sacrifices prepared, one for himself and Yahweh, and one for the hundreds of prophets who serve Baal and Ashereth. The challenge is simple. Whichever god or gods can miraculously light the sacrificial fire first will be the God of Israel moving forward. For hours, the false prophets ritually dance, scream, and even cut themselves in their attempts to call on their gods, but the sacrifice remains unlit. The seemingly irrelevant details in the passage that follow are actually Elijah's attempt to ritually reform Israel into a stable mandala and therefore draw the archetype of the self into existence at its center. Quote, he repaired at the damaged altar of the Lord. Then Elijah took 12 stones, corresponding to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come. Israel shall be your name. And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. Around the altar he made a trench large enough for 2 seahs of seed. He laid out the wood, and he cut up the bull and laid it on the wood. And he said, fill 4 jars with water and pour it over the burnt offering and the wood. Then he said, do it a second time. And they did it a second time. Do it a third time, he said, and they did it a third time. The water ran down around the altar, and even the trench was filled with water. Then fire from the Lord descended and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, and the stones, and the earth, and it even licked up the water that was in the trench. Figure 5 is a bird's eye view depiction of Elijah's accepted offering. When viewed in this way, we see all of the ingredients for a traditional mandala: an outer circle, the trench, balanced numbers and multiples of 4, 4 buckets of water poured 3 times on the altar of 12 stones, a centering symbol of the self, the divine fire descending from the heavens. But perhaps the most important detail comes at the very beginning of the ritual, when Elijah repairs the damaged altar of the Lord. Despite the fact that the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin had permanently split away from Israel nearly a century prior, the text repeatedly highlights the fact that Elijah is naming the stones after all 12 of the sons of Jacob, thus symbolically repairing the damaged mandala of Israelitish society. Elijah's offering at Mount Carmel is a microcosm of the foreshadow's larger mission in life. Like John preparing the way of the Lord, like Moses preparing the people for their journey to receive the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai, like Samuel preparing Israel for its anointed king, Elijah meticulously prepares the ritual sacrifice for the imminent arrival of the self. As soon as the offering is consumed, rain returns to the land, and Israel, for a short time, returns to Yahweh. It would seem baffling for Israel to reject Yahweh so soon after witnessing Elijah's extraordinary miracles at Mount Carmel, if the people had not done this so many times before. Indeed, requesting the golden calf while Mount Sinai smokes and quakes beside them, or demanding an earthly king while their superpowered judge kills 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, is no less baffling. Nevertheless, Elijah is treated as a criminal rather than as a hero for bringing Israel back to her ancestral deity, and is forced to flee for his life into the wilderness, the Foreshadow's natural home from the wrath of Queen Jezebel. Despite Elijah's best efforts, Israel chooses to continue down the steady path toward destruction. But regardless of the final outcome, the Foreshadow has completed his mission and now must head quickly toward his own mysterious end. Before doing so, however, Yahweh sends Elijah, like Samuel, to anoint a new king, and, like Moses, to anoint a prophet in his place. Elijah anoints Elisha as his heir, and presumably spends time training him in the ways of the prophet of Israel. But eventually, Elijah sees that his time is up and heads with Elisha one final time into the wilderness. When they are stopped by a river, Elijah channels his archetypal powers as Foreshadow and divides the waters just as Moses had done. As they are crossing, Elijah asks Elisha what he can give him before he is taken away, and Elisha asks for a double portion of his master's spirit. A moment later, a fiery chariot with fiery horses suddenly appeared and separated one from the other, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. End quote. There is perhaps no better image for passing on of an archetypal essence than this picturesque moment when Elisha, quite literally, picks up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from heaven, and just as Joshua tests his newly inherited powers by parting the seas, as his mentor Moses had done, Elisha strikes the river with Elijah's mantle and crosses on dry land. But it is important to note here that according to tradition, Elijah did not actually die. He is one of only two figures, including the ancient Enoch, who are taken bodily into heaven. Archetypally, this once again adds a sense of ambiguity and non-finality to the Foreshadow's end. Like Moses, Samuel, and of course John the Baptist, Elijah has a role to play in the afterlife. Quote, Jews still expect the Messiah, and in their synagogues they keep a chair of Elijah, the prophet who is to come and announce the Messiah. They place newly circumcised male babies into the chair in hopes that Elijah will announce this child as the Messiah. For Christians, this Elijah has come, and he is the preacher and prophet John the Baptist. Conclusion: Elijah, Salome, and the lineage of the Foreshadow. Quote, what a strange couple, Salome and Elijah, but Elijah assured me that he and Salome had belonged together from all eternity. C.G. Jung, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, page 181. Though his studies were truly extensive, there is no evidence that Jung was aware, at least consciously, of the more direct connections between Elijah the prophet and John the Baptist demonstrated above. But this lack of conscious awareness makes his Elijah dream all the more significant. In 1913, Jung's personal break with Freud mixed with the looming shadow of World War I to send him into what he described as a psychotic crisis. In December of that year, the waves of psychic content which flooded his mind culminated in the following dream. The atmosphere was that of the other world. Near the steep slope of a rock I caught sight of two figures, an old man with a white beard and a young, beautiful girl. I summoned up my courage and approached them as though they were real people, and I listened attentively to what they told me. The old man explained that he was Elijah, and that gave me a shock, but the girl staggered me even more, for she called herself Salome. She was blind. What a strange couple, Salome and Elijah. But Elijah assured me that he and Salome had belonged together from all eternity. On the surface, Jung's personal surprise at the apparent odd couple is quite justified. The figure of Salome does not appear in any of the stories of Elijah, nor indeed in the Old Testament at all. Instead, Salome is a small yet important figure in the mythos of John the Baptist. After John completes his mission as foreshadow by baptizing Jesus, his narrative quickly moves toward its conclusion. John marches into the court of King Herod of Galilee and accuses him of unlawfully divorcing his wife and marrying his brother's wife. According to the story, this insult enrages Herod's new wife, who encourages the king to imprison John. Sometime later, at a banquet, Herod is deeply moved by the dancing of Salome, his new wife's daughter. In a classic motif, Herod rewards Salome with whatever she might ask for and instantly regrets his promise. Salome is convinced by her mother to ask Herod for the head of the imprisoned John the Baptist. Like both Samson and Merlin the magician, John is brought to his end by natural charm of a woman. Many artistic retellings of the story put a more romantic spin on the relationship between John and Salome, including Oscar Wilde's Salome and Richard Strauss's 1905 opera, which is based on it. With this in mind, Elijah's ambiguous relationship with the beautiful Salome in Jung's dream should be no surprise. Though it was not until now been given a name, Elijah and John are both foreshadow figures, and thus fill the same archetypal role. As Jung's unconscious mind opened further into the collective unconscious, a flood of archetypal contents overtook him, among these a foreshadow figure, and it becomes even more clear that Jung was being visited by a foreshadow figure when we analyze his next significant dream. Soon after this fantasy, another figure rose out of the unconscious. He developed out of the Elijah figure. I call him Philemon. Philemon was a pagan, an old man with the horns of a bull. The collective unconscious cares not for narrative consistency or historical accuracy, but only for archetypal essence. The result was a figure with the name of Elijah, the consort of John the Baptist, the long flowing beard and animal horns of Moses, and a smattering of other archetypal associations. We may call him Elijah the prophet, Philemon the pagan, Moses the lawgiver, or John the Baptist. We might also call him the foreshadow of the self. This chapter looked at a series of Old Testament foreshadow figures who do not pave the way for a human embodiment of the self, but rather for an unpersonified object symbol of the self. These foreshadow figures almost spontaneously emerge during transitional periods in Israel's history. Moses marks the boundary way between Israel's captivity in Egypt and its entrance into the Promised Land. Samson is arguably the last judge before Samuel serves as prophet to the first kings of Israel. Elijah emerges after the monarchy permanently breaks in two and serves as Yahweh's final attempt to sway Israel from their impending fall. Though these liminal phases often mark historically notable events in a secular sense, their true significance can be seen as changes to Israel's relationship with its God by means of the arrival or degradation of the dominant symbol of the self around which Israelitish society revolves. And more often than not, a foreshadow figure emerges from the wilderness to usher in this new era. One of the wonders of the archetypes of the collective unconscious is, as Hillman says, their ability to manifest, quote, in ever-recurring motifs and ever-new variations like music. This helps to explain how the many foreshadow figures explored in this dissertation can each be so unique while simultaneously having so much in common. Bulgakov, speaking to this same phenomenon, devotes an entire chapter of Friend of the Bridegroom to the paradoxical way in which John is Elijah, though Elijah is not John. The forerunner somehow contains Elijah, transcending him without coinciding with him. But in Alone with the Alone, Corbin connects Elijah to another figure, Al-Qadir, the mysterious green man of the Islamic world. Quote, Kadir and Elijah are sometimes associated to form a pair and sometimes identified with one another. What concerns us here is the person of Kadir Elijah as initiator of the mystic truth. End quote. John the Baptist is Elijah. Al-Qadir is Elijah. And according to Merlin, shaman and prophet, Merlin is Elijah. Quote, Elijah becomes the archangel Sandalphon, the way shower. Perhaps we are not stretching this idea too far if we suggest that the next reappearance of this mighty being is Merlin himself. End quote. In the next chapter, this secular figure of Merlin the magician will further complicate and eventually help to untangle the strange lineage of Old Testament prophets with whom he has so much in common. Quote, Despite their many differences, these figures share certain important aspects. They are all mysterious, shadowy beings who appear at a time of crucial import to a particular group of people and who have neither an orthodox beginning nor end to their lives. Finally, each withdraws or disappears, leaving conflicting accounts of their actual existence, function, or allegiance. In the end, the lineage discussed above cannot rightly be pinned to the Old Testament prophets at all. The archetypal connections, which reach outside of the biblical paradigm, are simply too direct and too abundant to be claimed by a single tradition. Instead, we must view the growing web of connections between figures, motifs, and iconographical details as the lineage of the foreshadow archetype itself, recurring in vast arrays of cultures and time periods with both freshness and familiarity all at once.